Here we are going to study about the orbit. You can see the orbits are pyramidal shape and they are pyramidal bony cavities which are situated one on each side of the root of nose. So this is the root of the nose. On the side of root of the nose there are two bony orbits. They provide the sockets for rotatory movements of eyeballs. They also protect these eyeballs. Now coming to the four-sided pyramid. So what are its structures? Let us see. It is having one apex. That apex is towards inside. So inside it is having an apex which is situated at the posterior end of orbit, at the medial end of superior orbital fissure over here. Okay, and the base. The base is nothing but the surface which you see now is the base. Okay, it is seen as orbital opening on the face. It is having four walls. So what are those four walls? It is having a roof, it is having a floor, and also it is having a lateral wall and a medial wall. So now coming to the long axis of the orbit, which passes backward and medially, and the medial walls of two orbits are parallel with each other, but if you see the lateral walls, they will be right angles to each other. So now let us discuss about the roof of the bony socket. So if you see the roof, it is concave from side to side and it is formed mainly by orbital plate of frontal bone. So it is formed by the frontal bone orbital plate, and it is completed posteriorly by you can see this is the lesser wing of the sphenoid. Now coming to the relations of this roof, the roof is separated it separates the orbit from the anterior cranial fossa. The frontal air sinus may extend into the anterior medial part. Over here, the frontal air sinus may extend. So now coming to the named features. There are lacrimal fossa. So what is lacrimal fossa? It is located somewhere over here. It is placed anterolaterally, lodges the lacrimal gland. Now coming to the optic canal. The optic canal is present over here. This one is called as optic canal. It is lying posteriorly at the junction of roof and medial wall. You can see clearly this is the optic canal. And next coming to the trochlear fossa. The trochlear fossa is here. The trochlear fossa lies anterior-medially. So somewhere over here will be the trochlear fossa. It provides attachment to fibrous pullae or trochlea for tendon of superior oblique muscle. So let me show the same diagram of this lacrimal fossa, optic canal, trochlear fossa by means of other diagram. So you can see here this diagram which is given in our textbook. Here it shows the lacrimal fossa which is present anterior-laterally and lodges the lacrimal gland, and this is the optic canal which is present posteriorly at the junction of roof and medial wall, and this is the trochlear fossa which is lies anterior medially and provide attachment to fibrous pullae or trochlea for tendon of superior oblique muscle. Okay, so now let us discuss about the lateral wall. So this is the lateral wall. It is the thickest wall, strongest wall of the orbit. It is formed by anterior surface of greater wing of sphenoid bone posteriorly. So if you see posteriorly, it is formed by greater wing of sphenoid and by orbit surface of frontal process of zygomatic bone anteriorly. So you can see this is a zygomatic bone frontal process. Now coming to the relations of this lateral wall, the great wing of sphenoid separates the orbit from the middle cranial fossa, and the zygomatic bone separates it from temporal fossa. Now coming to the named features of the lateral wall. The superior orbital fissure occupies the posterior part of junction between the roof and lateral wall. So here you will be having the superior orbital fissure. This one, this line you can see clearly, this is the superior orbital fissure which is between the posterior part of junction between roof and lateral wall. So this one is the superior orbital fissure. Now coming to foramen of zygomatic nerve. Of course it will be in the zygomatic process. Here there will be a zygomatic foramen where there is passage of zygomatic nerve. Now coming to tubercle, that is Whitnall's tubercle. The Whitnall's tubercle or zygomatic tubercle is palpable elevation on zygomatic bone just within the orbital margin. It provides attachment to lateral check ligament of eyeball. So it is located here, this one. This is the White-Nall's tubercle. So let me show it in this diagram. You can see clearly this is the White-Nall's tubercle, and this is the superior orbital fissure, the same which I have shown here, this one, right? Now let us discuss the floor. You can see at the floor it is sloping upwards. The floor is sloping upwards medially to join medial wall. It is formed mainly by orbital surface of maxilla. You can see the maxilla bone only will form the orbital surface here, and also by the lower part of orbital surface of zygomatic bone here. Okay, anterior laterally. So if you see anterior laterally, it is formed by zygomatic bone, and if you see somewhat medially and lower floor is formed by maxilla, almost by maxilla, and this side you will be having a lacrimal bone medially. And also there will be an orbital process of palatine bone at the posterior angle. So now coming to relation, so this medial wall separates the orbit from maxillary sinus. Maxillary sinus will be back of maxilla. Next, coming to named features, the inferior orbital fissure occupies the posterior part of junction between the lateral wall and floor. So between the lateral wall and floor, you can see this one. This is called as inferior orbital fissure. Okay, through this fissure, orbit communicates with infratemporal fossa anteriorly and with pterygopalatine fossa posteriorly. So you can see, if you see from side, there will be here the infratemporal fossa, this is supratemporal fossa. So by means of this inferior orbital fissure, the orbit will communicate with the infratemporal fossa below anteriorly and pterygopalatine fossa posteriorly. Now coming to infraorbital groove. So the infraorbital groove runs forwards in relation to this floor. So here it will run forward. There is a small depression on anterior-medial part of floor which give origin to inferior oblique muscle. So now coming to the medial wall. So before showing the medial wall, let us understand this by means of this diagram. So here you can see this is the inferior orbital fissure, and this is the infraorbital groove, and this is the orbital process of palatine bone. Now let us discuss about the medial wall and its relations. So if you see the medial wall, it is very thin from before backwards. It is formed by the frontal process of maxilla, the lacrimal bone, and the orbital plate of ethmoid and body of sphenoid posteriorly. So the relations are, there is a lacrimal groove formed by the maxilla and the lacrimal bone which separates the orbit from nasal cavity, and the orbit plate of ethmoid separates the orbit from ethmoidal air sinuses, and there is a sphenoidal sinus are separated from orbit only by thin layer of bone on posterior side. So the named features are, the lacrimal groove lies anteriorly on the medial wall. It is bounded anteriorly by lacrimal crest of frontal process of maxilla, and posteriorly by the crest of lacrimal bone. The floor of groove is formed by maxilla in front and by lacrimal bone behind. The groove lodges lacrimal sac, which lies deep to lacrimal fascia, bridging the lacrimal groove. The groove leads inferiorly though to the nasolacrimal duct to inferior meatus of nose. Actually, if you put here, there will be a gap. If you put here the pen, then it will come below this inferior nasal concha. Okay. So the anterior and posterior ethmoid foramina lie on frontoethmoid suture. Anterior and posterior ethmoid foramina lie on frontoethmoid suture at the junction of root of medial wall. Actually in this diagram we are not able to see all of this, but in real skull it is very easy to see all these features clearly. So finally, let us see all the things what we have discussed in this diagram to end this lecture. So here you can see this is the orbital surface of lesser wing of sphenoid, and this is a superior orbital fissure. This is the orbital surface of greater wing of sphenoid, and this is the orbital process of palatine bone. This is a zygomaticofacial foramen. This is the orbital surface of zygomatic bone. This is the inferior orbital fissure. This is the orbital surface of maxilla, infraorbital foramen, infraorbital groove, maxilla, nasal bone, orbital plate of ethmoid bone, orbital surface of frontal bone, supraorbital notch. So by this we are completed. Next we'll start with fetal skull and neonatal